Hey yo, I'm Miss Linnea Lark, and I'm back with part 4 of our tile carving lesson. Last time I taught you how to use the slab roller and how to trace your designs onto your tile. Today we're going to learn how to carve order so that your shapes and their planes become three-dimensional. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to clearly see my 3 planes and be able to recognize which shapes are in the front, in between, and which shapes are behind the other shapes. Carving versus incising. There are 2 major ways to hand carve, and we will be using both of those on our tiles. The first that you see here is an example of incising, where you use a sharp object to cut into the clay to draw or make marks. Incising can be a good way to draw lines and a powerful way to create texture later on, but it doesn't make your image 3D. It's basically just drawing on clay. The second type of carving that you see here is relief carving, where you cut away parts of the clay to make a shape stand out. Notice for this heart, I start by drawing my image as a shape instead of as a simple line. I then carve away the background, and this is relief carving. Notice how three-dimensional the carving is. When carving our tiles, we're going to start with relief carving our shapes so that we can see each 3D plane defined by shadow. Notice how all my lines are gone now. Each shape looks 3D. Let's dive in a little bit deeper to the relief carving process. Here's a quick look at my preferred carving process. The first step is to observe my reference. Secondly, I draw my shapes lightly into my clay. The third step is to relief carve my shapes, creating depth. I'll give you the last 2 steps in our next video, but for now, all I want you to focus on is making these shapes look 3D. In our last video, we traced our line drawings out onto our tiles. In this video, we will be focusing on the third step to relief carve my shapes, creating depth. How to relief carve. Okay, now it's time to actually learn how to carve. The goal of relief carving is to turn your flat, drawn shapes into 3D forms that overlap one another, creating depth. When we're finished relief carving, you will be able to see each shape defined by 3D edges and shadow. And this is really important. You will not be able to see any lines anymore. Notice how all of my shapes are currently defined by outline drawn or incised into the clay. While our job is to carve them out, let me show you how on this example of a pangolin scales. The first step is to observe my reference. I like to get a feel for the shapes that I will be carving. In the second step, I draw out my shapes. This is also a good time to think about your style. You can draw your shapes super realistically, or you might simplify your shapes into something more stylized. It's up to you. But remember, when relief carving, every line you draw should be a shape, and these shapes shouldn't be really super small. Thirdly, I need to identify the order of the shapes, starting with the background. This area here is the background, as it is behind all of the shapes. I then identify the shapes that are in the back, furthest away from the viewer. And these are all the shapes that are behind the other shapes. Notice how these shapes are overlapping the background. I then identify all the shapes that are on the middle plane. Here are my middle shapes. Notice they have shapes on top of them and beneath them, because they're in the middle. And last, I identify all the shapes on the top plane, which are these. Now that I know which planes all my shapes are in, and which are in front and behind, I can begin carving. In the fourth step, I like to carve from the back to the front. And this is important because in relief carving, we make sure that we are carving halfway through our clay, but no further. Going deeper than halfway can cause our tiles to crack or break. Carving from the back to the front allows me to start with the deepest area first, making a clear visual barrier. Once I carve my background halfway deep, I will easily be able to see how deep halfway is and be sure not to carve deeper anywhere else on my tile. To carve my background halfway through, I like to mark the halfway point all along the outside of my tile using a dotted line. This is really helpful for beginners to visualize how deep their deepest marks can go. When I'm done carving out my background, I'll erase that dotted line, but for now it's a good visual indicator as well. I carve out the background halfway through the clay. I like to use a series of ribbon tools by gently slicing away one layer at a time. Be extra careful if your tile is on the wet side, as it is easy to slice too deep, and these tools are thin metal that can slice through the clay very easily. Carving in general is best done on leather to leather hard clay. It should be at least slightly set up, but while it's still a little bit wet, be extra careful while it's in that leather stage. Make sure each pass of the trimming tool is firm and smooth, cutting off slim and skinny layers at a time. If you try to take giant chunks out, it is easy to go too deep without realizing it. I keep carving here and there, making it smoother and flatter and deeper as I go. Make sure that your background is smooth before moving on. Notice how I use a scoring tool to sand down then smooth out all the hills. Now that I've carved out my background, notice that 3 things have happened. My outlines are gone and have been replaced with an edge. There's no more outline to the shapes on top of my background. Secondly, the edge of the shapes on top cast a shadow onto my background. This is important because in a proper relief carving, shadows define the shapes, not outline. If you're finding it difficult to recognize your shapes, it doesn't mean that you need an outline. It means you need more shadow, which means that you need to carve deeper down, or it might mean that you need to carve at a more pronounced angle so that your shadow is defining your shapes a little bit better. And the third thing that you might notice is that I have carved an undercut beneath the shapes on top of my background. This creates the illusion that it is on top of the background, and it casts an even more intense shadow, making it look more 3D. This is a nice optical illusion that you can use in your carvings. Now that I've got my background carved out, I'm going to go up a step to the shapes I identified earlier as being in the back. I carve around the lines, digging a deep trench beneath them. It's important to go deep, but not deeper than the background. Notice that when I carve around the lines, it leaves an awkward trench or ditch around that area. It's a good start, but we want to get rid of this trench by gradually carving it to the same height as the flat clay. So we need to gradually carve the trench into the rest of the shape. Notice that I don't carve the whole shape down flat like a flat stair step, but I carve it at an angle. This way the edge that overlaps the background maintains a high edge and creates a dark shadow on the background. Carving each plane on an angle like this creates an optical illusion that there is more depth and it is more 3D. I then do the same thing on the middle shapes. When carving, students tend to do a good job smoothing the tops of the planes. However, messy walls or cliff faces are the true gauge for clean craftsmanship. Make sure that you're paying attention to those areas as well. Notice how when I'm smoothing out my trench, that the flat top of the plane is getting more smooth and more level. But look at the cliff, at the messy raccoon-chewed mangled wall that is supposed to be defining the shape with shadow. It's atrociously gunky and rough. Awful craftsmanship. But finally, I notice my mangled edges and see how I use my tools to not only smooth out the flat planes, but to also smooth out the walls and cliff edges. Notice how in some areas my middle shapes overlap the bottom shapes and also the background, creating 3 separate planes. It's important to make sure that the back bottom shapes look like it is truly behind the middle shapes. You may have to carve more off of the bottom shape to get clear planes. Now we move on to the top shapes and carve around them. It's good not to carve your initial trench quite as deep as the first 2. You can always go deeper if you think your carving needs more dimension. With carving, once you carve something away, it's gone forever, so cautiously carve deeper and deeper. Notice that each of my shapes are now defined with a carved edge and a shadow instead of a drawn outline. Also notice that my shapes are all flat, but are carved at a diagonal with an undercut to intensify the shadows. The last thing I need to do, once my relief carving is done, is clean up all my marks. Get rid of any gunky carved bits floating around, and erase the dotted line on the outside of my clay. Everything should be so fresh and so clean. At this point in the process, I observed my reference picture, I drew my shapes into the clay, and relief carved all my shapes out so that they are 3D and are now defined by shadow. Look, no more lines to be found anywhere. Now that you understand the first half of the carving process, I want to give you some helpful tips for carving your tiles. Notice that when I'm using these relief carving skills on my tile, that I focus in on one area at a time. I use my needle tool to trace around the shape that I'm going to begin carving, careful not to go deeper than I actually want to carve. Remember, you can always go deeper, but if you go too deep, you make the clay weak and it potentially cracks on those lines later. When I'm beginning an area, I notice what's behind and what's in front. I think about how deeply I want to carve to create the illusion of order. Notice how the blobby shape is under the circle, but it's also over the coral area in the middle. This means that I have to carefully carve down the bottom of the blobby shape so that it looks like it's beneath the circle. But when I'm smoothing out the trench, I need to be careful that I'm not taking too much off, or else I won't be able to make it look like it's on top of the coral area. Notice how I carved out both of these shapes, but in this area there is very little shadow, which makes it difficult for my eye to distinguish between the two shapes. This is normal. What's happened is that I've carved it enough that the outline is gone, which is what we're looking for, but I haven't carved it enough to see a strong shadow, so I gotta keep going. I can fix this two ways. First, I could simply carve deeper so that there's a high cliff between the two shapes. Or secondly, I can carve an undercut underneath the top shape. I usually opt for both. Just remember, your shapes need to be clearly defined before we move on to the next step of carving texture. And for my students, this will be a mandatory check-in for you. When you think all your shapes are 3D and defined by shadow, ask your table mates if you need more shadow anywhere. And if they give you the go-ahead, then you can come check in with me. And then as a class, we'll move on to part 5, how to carve and incise textures. And also notice that when I'm beginning, especially when the clay is a little bit on the wet side, that it's not neat, it's not clean. There's a lot of scraps and there's a lot of gunk and there's a lot of clay kind of going everywhere. I like to hone in on one area at a time, but then I'm always tweaking it, going back and forth, making sure that I've got my planes really obvious and noticeable. Don't worry too much about all the gunk. We're going to do cleanup at the end. In fact, when the clay is really kind of fresh and wet and in that leather stage, not quite leather hard, that's okay. I actually like that because it allows me to go deeper a little bit easier. However, when the clay is on the wet side, you're going to notice that all the little gunks, all your chippings that fall off are wet, and so they stick to everything, and it's really obnoxious. However, you will waste time and energy trying to make everything clean as you go. You kind of want to just allow this ugly gunk to take over your piece, and then as it starts to dry up, when we're getting closer to finishing, all those little gunks will dry out fast because they're small, and then they'll easily just chip away. And you can use like a dry paintbrush to wipe them away off of your tile without harming your image. But if you're constantly using your energy and your time in class to make everything look clean, you're not going to be able to take large strides forward. So just beware that at the beginning stages of carving, it's pretty messy. At the end of every class, we're going to clean the gunk off of our edges and our boards so that when we bag it with water, all the gunk doesn't re-squish back into the tile. Clay is constantly drying out, and it can be difficult to know when your clay is at the optimal wetness or dryness for carving. Leather hard is truly the best stage for carving clay, as it's firm enough to hold its shape but also wet enough that important parts aren't chipping off. At the beginning, you'll have to be careful because it's likely that your clay is on the wet side. Notice here how my clay is actually still pretty wet. You can tell because when I dig out my trench, the scooping and digging movements actually move the still wet pangolin scale above it. Did you see that? Be careful when you're in this stage. Carving is still possible, but just be gentle and don't spray your piece while you're carving on clay this wet. Here's how to tell if your clay is getting dangerously dry. Notice that while I'm carving, the carving bits are coming off in more dry and flaky chips. To be honest, I like this stage of dryness. However, you have to maintain it with water or else it gets even drier and then your carved details start to chip away, and that is even more annoying than carving super wet clay. Once it chips away, it's gone. Before spraying your tile, always make sure to brush clean all the gunk on your tile and on the board. If you spray it, the gunk on it will reseal into your tile and you'll have to carve it all off again. Except this time it'll be even messier. Bummer. I spray my piece anytime I notice that my carvings are turning into dried chips, as you see here. I give it 2 to 4 healthy sprays of water. Notice how wet and glistening the clay looks. I let it absorb into the clay for a moment or two so that the water sinks into the clay and my carvings aren't overly wet and annoyingly gunky. And then I just continue carving. When bagging your tiles, it's important to keep them in the leather hard stage, and that takes a little time to get to. If your carving gunk is still pretty wet and squishy, that means that your tile is still in the wet or leather stages. While it's still on the wet side, at night you still want to wet your bag and rainforest it. However, you do want to allow your tile to touch your board so that it sucks out some of that extra moisture. Remember, it's always better to be a little bit on the wet side than on the dry side. If, when you carve your tile, the gunk is more of a firm chip that is easily brushed away, then I would probably spray a clean bag and then place your tile directly into the bag so that your board doesn't continue to dry it out. You might have to go back and forth between allowing your tile to touch the board and putting it in the bag, but just be careful that when you're carving that it's not too dry so that the edges start to chip. That's the worst case scenario. Now I hope you guys understand a little bit more about relief carving. We're going to start soon, but first together we're going to take a few minutes and practice with our tools. Let's practice with those tools. We're going to get a closer look at some of these carving tools and practice with them. It's very important that while the video is running, that your hands are empty of all tools and that your attention and eyes are on the screen. When you see this golden pause button on your screen, you'll be free to practice whatever skill I've been showing you. But for now, I need everybody's eyes on the TV and everybody paying close attention. Thank you. The first thing that you need to know about carving tools is that any tool can do a number of things, and that anything can actually be a tool. You can use an old CD. You could use a paper towel. You could use a wire brush from the sink. I use a toothbrush sometimes for effects. Anything in your life can be used as a tool. Notice how I can use this needle tool to draw, I can use it to carve, and I can also use it to smooth edges on my clay. As long as you are being safe, there's no right or wrong way to use the tool. I can also use a metal rib to smooth the clay, which was the intention of the maker. However, I could also use it to make marks or to slice. Be safe with the tools, but also be creative. Explore and take risks. Safe risks. You might get a mark you don't like or isn't what you intended, but you could also find an awesome new way to use a tool that no one's ever thought of. In the long run, knowing how to use your tools or different ways to use your tools is going to make your life as a sculptor a lot easier. Learning your tools and how to use them is of great value, so let's go ahead and practice using them on our scrap slab. We're going to take a look at some great relief carving tools and practice using them together. If you're not one of my students and you don't have the same tools that we have in our studio, try to find a similar tool or dig through your kitchen or toolbox to find an object that could give you a similar effect. If you are interested in buying the same tools that I enjoy using, you can check out my Amazon affiliate link in the description below. You'll be able to purchase my favorite tools on Amazon, and they will kindly give me a small commission. Thanks for your support. First up, ribbon tools, also called trimming tools. We have a variety of sizes and shapes. It's smart to use larger ribbon tools for larger areas and smaller ribbon tools for smaller areas. Ribbon tools aren't super easy to keep your areas smooth. You have to have a really steady hand, so this is going to take a little bit of practice. Ribbon tools are used to trim small chunks of clay away at a time. It's probably the fastest way to get rid of a large section, but notice that it can also leave a lot of lines behind. Let's practice using the ribbon tool to carve down a shape halfway through our slab. When I pause the video, you're going to draw a kind of large triangle on the edge of your practice slab. Before you try carving it, draw a dotted line on the side of the slab so that you know how far down halfway is. Then, using a ribbon tool, try to carve the shape down with several flat and level passes. Don't try to shave too much off at one time or else you might slice right through your slab. Try to keep your hand steady and control how deep you cut. Remember, we never want to carve deeper than halfway through the clay. When you are finished, we shouldn't be able to see the dotted line anymore because you've carved it down to the dotted line. But if you can see it, be sure that you smooth it away. Go ahead. Now that the triangle is carved out halfway deep, we need to clean up our craftsmanship. Make sure that the bottom is level and smooth. I use my favorite scoopy tool to smooth out any hills. You also need to make sure that the walls or cliffs on the edges are smooth, compressed, and clear of any clay gunk. Another good tool to try is the long, round side of the needle tool. And then finally, I use a wet paintbrush to make sure all the walls and edges are smooth and crisp. Notice how my shadow is clear and strong because I carved an undercut, creating a stronger shadow. Make sure your triangle is crisp and smooth with clean craftsmanship and a strong shadow. Go ahead. Now that we've tried out the ribbon tools, it's time to check out those wooden tools. Wooden tools are great, especially when your clay is still on the soft side, which ours are today, most likely. Wooden tools will absorb the moisture from the clay, and they are typically pretty thick and will not easily pierce or cut through your clay. We have a variety of tips, some sharp and some round. Let's draw a circle on our slabs and use a sharp wooden tool to carve around it. Start by carving out large chunks around the entire circumference of your circle. After I do that, notice how I've got a deep trench around my entire circle. It looks clunky and bad. So I'm going to use my wooden tool to soften and gradually transition the carving into the surface of our clay. We want a smooth transition. Go ahead. Now we're going to practice using a round ribbon tool. This allows us to get hills and softer, rounder areas. Start by carving a deep circle in the middle of your circle, then carve away at the center of your tile until you get a smooth dip in the middle. Feel free to move your slab around so that you can get the optimal angles for your carving. When you're finished, it should look like a low dip in the middle. Go ahead. Now let's draw 3 shapes. One tiny shape, one small shape, and one medium-sized shape. Any shape you like. Go ahead. Let's practice using different metal tip tools to scoop out and carve out the shapes. Let's start with the largest shape. Go ahead. The smaller your shape, the harder it will be to get a large tool inside. So here's a tip. You can use your needle tool to draw a grid and then chip out each square. These are called relief cuts, and they're useful for when your tool is a little bit too big to get inside of a small shape. I use this effect on my second shape. Go ahead. For my smallest shape, I don't even need to carve. I just need to find any tool that will fit kind of perfectly inside of that shape, and I just press it down inside. It's a little bit cheat and mess, but it works. Go ahead. And now we're going to do a little exercise with one of my favorite metal tip tools. It's probably the one that I use the most. I call it the Scoopy tool. I highly recommend the Kemper one. I've tried the off-brand ones, but the curvature and the scoopiness of the Kemper one is bar none. It has a wooden handle, and if you find a newer one, it might even still have a triangular blade on the back side. But honestly, I don't even like that blade there because it cuts into my hand, so I pull them out. And every side of the tool is useful. You can scrape with it, you can compress with it. Let's check it out. You'll see. It's great. Put your hand on your clay and use 4 fingers to trace 4 lines. If you don't have enough room, try to just draw 4 lines side by side. If you're right-handed, we're going to carve down the right side of each of these lines. If you're left-handed, carve on the left side of each of the lines. I use the tip right up against the line. I angle it downward so that I can truly scrape and shovel along the line. Using the tip and the edge of the scoopy tool, we can quickly and easily carve down into our clay. The scoop acts like a little shovel. Now we have a big trench next to our line. We need to transition that trench gradually up to the surface of the clay. This will create a stair-step effect. Isn't that nice? So 3D. Go ahead. And lastly, let's just take a few moments to use any tools in your toolbox that you haven't tried yet. Try carving shapes out and carving around shapes. Try dragging, scooping, and scraping your tools across your clay. Try to find 2 or more uses for each of your tools. Go ahead. Alright, that's the last bit of practice we're going to do together, but you still need to save this piece of clay so that we can practice our textures on it later. It can be helpful to try out tools, new ways of using tools, and also for comparing different tools. So make sure you keep this scrap clay watered and bagged. Alright you guys, I've taught you a little bit about relief carving. Come back next time and we'll learn more about incising textures into our work. This is gonna be cool. Thank you guys for listening and watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It just feels so good. Like me. Everybody like me. Share my video with whoever you think might use it. Alright, baby birds. I hope you have a happy day, and I'll see you next time. Adios.